In a back room of the Merrill County Courthouse, where the air smells like hemp dust and old ink, there is a single sheet of paper that does not behave. It lies in a stack of house tax bills from the year 1864, all browned and brittle, all stamped once and filed away, all but one. On that bill, for a weather-warped house on a rise above Ash Fork, the clerk stamped the paid mark twice, like he was trying to nail the thing down and still could not. The ink of the second stamp has bled out in a strange bloom, red, leaking into the fibers like a slow bruise. Somebody, long dead now, pressed harder than they needed to, so hard the wood of the stamp left a faint circle around the word. You can almost feel the shake in that hand, can you not? As if the person holding it wanted this house to vanish off the books and feared it never would. The amount is the same, the date is the same, but the second stamp falls over the first like an echo. The house belongs to the Grindle clan, at least on paper. Out in Ash Fork, they only ever called them the Hill family, as if saying their name out loud might draw something down. They lived on pilings over a low crawl space, on a finger of land that reached toward the Blackwater River and stopped short like it changed its mind. Folks whispered that they married under their own roof, that they kept to their own blood and their own rules. But you will not find those rumors in any church book. What you do find, if you turn the tax bill over, is a faint pencil note along the bottom edge and 3 words pressed into the paper hard enough to dent it, then half erased. Under house inspection, incomplete. The pencil trails off as if the clerk looked up at something, then never finished what he meant to write. Even now, a century and more later, those 3 crooked words feel like breath, rising from a floor that will not stay still. Outside that courthouse, the world of 1864 was burning itself apart. Men marched east in uniforms and came back in boxes or not at all. Yet in Ash Fork, in the bend where the river turns thick and dark under the cypress, another kind of war moved quiet under the boards. Bells from Mount Olive Church sometimes tolled at the wrong hour, long, slow notes in the middle of the afternoon, and nobody in town would say who they were for. Near the Hill House, cicadas that screamed all summer along the fence lines simply went quiet, as if the very sound had learned to step around that yard. Later, there would be a cellar ledger with a torn corner that would not balance, and a burial permit that did not match the name folks remembered. There would be a ferryman who noticed a chit number that came back again and again, and a teacher who wrote down the wrong child under the right family. But it begins here with one house tax bill stamped twice for a property that should have been simple, paid and done. So why could no one in Ash Fork quite bring themselves to look under that house on the hill where the crawl space, breathed like something that had learned hunger? Ash Fork in 1864 sat low in the throat of Merrill County, like a word nobody wanted to say out loud. The town had one brick street that turned to mud after the first hard rain, 2 churches that listened hard to one another, and a Blackwater River that wrapped the whole place in a slow, dark arm. Cypress trees leaned over the water like old men in council, and sometimes at dusk, the river wake ticked against the pilings of the ferry dock, like a clock that knew more than anyone else. From the main street, you could see the Grindle Hill if you dared to look past the livery and the feed store. Their house leaned on tall pilings, boards gray and warped, the underside open to a crawl space that never quite went dark or light, only stayed in a strange middle shade. Children were told that the hill air was bad for them, that the well up there had too much iron, that people who lived that far out preferred to be left alone. Nobody said the quieter thing, that the family on the hill had folded in on itself for so many generations that the town no longer knew where one ended and another began. It started, at least on record, with a farmhand named Luca Price. In May of that year, Luca did not show up for his shift at the mill or his rented pew at Mount Olive. The river was high then, swollen from spring rain, and the obvious thought was that he had slipped on the ferry plank and vanished into the black water. But there was no search party, No line of lanterns along the bank. No men with poles wading waist-deep. What there was, 2 days later, was a note on the courthouse desk. Luca, removed to Texas. That was it. 3 words in the same tight clerk hand that marked marriages and debts pinned to a rail spike with a tack. No one admitted to writing it, but it slid into the folder marked Price's Farm and settled there like a small dry stone. You know this already. Sometimes paper moves faster than boots on the ground, and in Ash Fork, paper had begun to move in strange ways. Downriver, the ferryman noticed first. His name was Eli Hatch, a man with sunburnt arms and a face carved by squint lines, who knew every family by the way they stepped onto his deck. In his pocket, along with a whittling knife and a bit of twine, Eli kept a stack of chits where he marked crossings and times for his own memory. One of those chits from the week Luca vanished bore a number he did not like, a number that would come back to haunt him. But in May, 1864, it was just ink on a scrap, still drying. Up the hill, the Grindle house watched the town with blank windows. Smoke rose from their kitchen chimney at odd hours, but no one saw them in town except on tax day and in occasional storms when they came to the store for lamp oil and salt. That spring, folks said they heard hammering under their floor well past midnight, long after the last lamp in Ash Fork had gone out. But the next morning, the house looked exactly the same. Perched on its pilings, the crawl space below, breathing a cool, wet air that smelled faintly of iron and damp cedar. By late summer of 1864, Marrow County had more dead than ground ready to receive them. The war took 1 out of every 3 men from Ash Fork, and the ones who came back limped through town with eyes fixed on a distance no one else could see. The county hired an undertaker from upriver, a tight-lipped man named Blass, who kept a cellar ledger for every box he measured and every grave he oversaw. That ledger, bound in cracked calfskin, would one day cause the bookkeeper real trouble. Blass wrote in careful columns: name, date, cause where he knew it, fee. For Luca Price, there is nothing. No box, no grave, no fee. Yet on a separate scrap tucked between the pages, the ink blooms like something alive. 1 adult, male, middle height, delivered by wagon at dawn, paid in cash. The line ends in a blot, as if someone bumped his elbow in the low lamplight. No name is written, only the words, Hill Road in the margin. You can almost smell that cellar if you close your eyes. Damp stone, lamp oil, a hint of iron from the tools, and something else under it. The heavy air that follows grief underground. A lantern, set on a shelf, throws light up into the joists, catching soot and spider web. Under that same light, Blass pressed his pen harder than usual, because his hand must have known what his mouth would never say. Around that time, a man began to linger near the courthouse door. His uniform coat, once Union blue, had faded to a tired gray, but the brass buttons still caught the sun. His name was Isaiah Cole, a black veteran who had learned to read orders, patrol maps, and lies all in the same glance. He watched the way papers moved through Marrow County, how a note could erase a body, how a ledger entry could make a person appear or vanish without anyone lifting a shovel. Isaiah took to talking with Eli the ferryman on slow afternoons. They would lean on the post at the river dock, listening to the water slap the pilings like a slow measured hand. Eli mentioned the odd chit from the day Luca went missing, the one with the Hill Road number that did not match any fare. Isaiah did not say much, only asked if he could see it, turning the small stained scrap in his fingers like a coin he did not trust. Farther up the road at Mount Olive Church, a seamstress named Miss Geneva sat in the back pew with her basket of mending. She sewed for half the town, stitching hems and cuffs and mourning bands, her eyes on the cloth while her ears gathered every rumor. When whispers of the Grindle Hill passed near her bench, she did what she always did with fear. She folded it into the nearest seam and pulled the thread tight. Remember the tax bill stamped twice for the Grindle Hill house, ink blooming like a bruise on old paper. The second disappearance happened in September, when the heat wrapped Ash Fork in a damp hand that never let go. A boy named Henry Shull, 12 years of age and all elbows, stopped attending the little school that met in the back of the general store. His teacher, a thin woman named Clara Finch, marked his absence on her slate with a piece of chalk that left a squeak that made the other children shiver. Clara went to inquire, as teachers do. The Shull cabin sat 3 streets back from the river, leaning into a stand of scrub pine. Henry's mother met her at the door with red eyes and a folded paper in her hand. Henry had gone to stay with kin up in Tennessee, she said. The paper said so. She unfolded it like proof, but the words were not hers. The letter was stiff with formal phrases and unfamiliar loops, stamped with the county seal, in a way that made Clara feel cold. At the courthouse, the sheriff filed the notice under Shull without looking twice. Sheriff Deacon was a man who moved along grooves worn deep before he was born. If a paper had the right seal and the clerk nodded as it passed, he slid it into the drawer it asked for and thought his duty done. Truth was only what had a stamp, and the weight of his ring on that drawer was all the judgment he cared to give. 2 days later, Blast the undertaker received another early wagon at his door. Again, one adult, male, height unknown, no name given. Again, the margin held 2 faint words: Hill House. The ink in this entry bloomed out worse than the last, as if the page had sucked at the nib with hungry fibers. Beside it, a number was written, then scratched half away. Anyone who studied that line could tell he had tried, at least once, to write more. Meanwhile, word passed that the Grindle clan had brought another load of lumber up the hill. The house sat on pilings tall enough for a grown man to crawl under, and lately, folks said the space beneath had begun to close in. Boards had appeared, nailed along the sides, leaving only narrow slits where the air could escape. Children who played too far up the road said they could hear hammering from under there long after dark, and sometimes a slow dragging sound like something heavy pulled along packed earth. The county issued a burial permit in late September for a man named Harold Pike, killed in a sawmill accident 2 towns over. The permit said he was buried in Marrow County soil in a lot near Mount Olive. Yet Clara, who taught Pike's youngest girl her letters, knew the family had taken the body back upriver. In the churchyard, there was no fresh dirt where that paper said there should be. The permit had one odd flaw. The initials in the margin did not match the undertaker who signed all the others. Autumn crept into Ash Fork, not with bright leaves, but with a slow grayness that settled into rafters and well water. The air tasted like damp cedar and distant smoke. The Grindle Hill house seemed to draw that gray toward itself, boards darkening from weather and something less simple. One morning, Eli the ferryman saw a new structure on the side of the house, a small lean-to that clung to the kitchen, like a second shadow. It was a pantry, or so folks in town were told when anyone was bold enough to ask, a place to store preserved beans and salted meat for the winter. But a teacher who paid attention to measurements will tell you that the lean-to did not seem to line up with the windows inside. Clara noticed this when she delivered a stack of old school books one Saturday, a donation for the Grindle children who never came down into town. Inside the kitchen, the air was heavy with lamp oil and iron from the stove. Floorboards creaked under Clara's feet in a way that felt like a learned reflex, like the wood had been taught to close back over sound. She spotted the pantry door, a plain plank with a latch, and beside the stove, another line of boards that did not quite match the rest of the wall. A panel, she realized, cut and set back in place with care. The eldest Grindle, a man named Abram, whose eyes never stayed long in one place, noticed her gaze. He stepped between her and that misaligned seam with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He thanked her for the books, his voice smooth as river silt. and mentioned a family arrangement that made school in town unnecessary. Clara left with a tight throat and the feeling that the house had watched her walk back down the hill. That night, rain moved over Marrow County in a thin, tired sheet. In the Finch room behind the store, Clara sat awake under the ticking of the ceiling clock, staring at a scrap of cloth in her hands. It was a hem she had taken to Miss Geneva for repair, one of Henry Scholl's cuffs. Geneva had handed it back with a neat straight stitch and tucked in the fold where no one would see. A single thread in a different color. 3 tiny letters spelled along the inside, almost too small to read. Hill. Crawlspaces were common in Ash Fork. Houses on low land had to lift themselves away from the rising river and the black damp that crawled up from the soil. But most of those spaces were open, breezes moving through, fat dogs lying in the shade. Only the Grindle place seemed to require boards nailed over the gap. Only on that hill did the space under the house exhale, a breath that felt too slow, too steady, too full. By November, the cellar ledger at Blass Undertaker's shop had begun to misbehave. Pages that had always lined up in neat columns now refused to balance. There were more entries for bodies than there were permits filed at the courthouse. Blass would sit at his narrow desk under the stairs, lamp burning low, adding and reading the figures until the numbers jittered on the page. Each time his eye snagged on that torn corner near the front of the book. Someone had ripped a triangle from one page, neat as if they had used a knife and not fingers. The missing piece had held a name, maybe, or a place. In its absence, ink from the next page bled through like a ghost. One adult, sex unknown, transferred from Hill property. The words hit Blass in the chest every time he saw them, though. He never told a soul. He only turned the page a little faster and reached for the lamp to adjust the flame. At the courthouse, a man named Lemuel Hart was paid to stare at numbers. County bookkeeper, they called him, though most thought of him as another piece of furniture behind the front desk. Hart had a gift, if you can call it that. Columns whispered to him when amounts did not add up, when dates leaned wrong against one another. He felt it like a splinter under the skin. It kept him awake more than once, this sense that the records were trying to confess. Lately, the Grindle Hill house had begun to show up in too many columns at once. Tax bill stamped twice. Payment for lumber not connected to any permit for new building. A small, untitled entry that read, "Only inspection requested," then crossed out so hard the nib tore the page. The duplicate burial permit for Pike, initials wrong, lay in a drawer under Hart's elbow like a hot stone. When he lined the dates up, he saw that this false burial coincided with Luca Price's sudden removal to Texas and Henry Scholl's neat erasure into Tennessee. Down at the river, Eli found that chit again. The same number that had marked Luca Price's last crossing now, there appeared on a newer scrap from early September. Passenger, covered wagon, Hill Road, dawn. He did not remember a face that day. Only the weight of the wagon on his planks and the way the river wake had ticked faster than usual, like a clock being wound too tight. He took the older chit from his pocket tin and laid them side by side on the barrel by his shack. Same number, same hand, same road. In Mount Olive Church, the bell rope had begun to tug itself at strange hours. 2 short tolls just after sunrise, 3 long ones late at night when the streets were empty. Geneva, who cleaned the nave and stitched the altar cloths, asked Reverend Gable if there were new funerals nobody had told her about. He said no, then hesitated, his eyes drifting toward the hill before he caught himself and lowered his gaze to his Bible instead. Remember the cellar ledger with the torn corner, where Hill property bled through from one page to the next. Winter did not come to Ash Fork with snow. It came with a kind of tired heat that refused to leave, a drought that dragged on after the last corn was dragged in. Wells grew shallow and bitter, the iron taste in the water growing stronger with each week. Folks muttered that the river was hoarding what the sky would not give, that the black water had grown stingy and thick. The Grindle Hill well had always tasted off, even in good years. Children dared one another to drink from its bucket when they walked past, then spat and wiped their tongues on their sleeves, laughing to hide the nerves. That winter the bucket came up with a film on top like lamp oil and a faint smell that made people hide their noses in their hands. Yet nobody in the family went down to the river for water. They drew from that tainted well and carried their buckets back through their own door as if it were the most natural thing in the world. One afternoon, the river fell so low that the pilings under Ellis Ferry stood on naked mud. He had to drag the boat out from shore and push off at a different angle, cursing under his breath. In the new shallows near the far bank, something pale pushed up through the silt. The corner of a crate or box that had not been there before. It rocked gently in the wake of the boat, ticking against a submerged log in a steady rhythm. Eli stared. His oar paused in mid-stroke. The box might have been an old freight crate, washed down from upriver. It might have been nothing at all. But the way it sat there, half buried and yet refusing to sink, made the hair rise on his arms. He marked the spot by eye and told himself he would come back at dusk with a rope. As he turned the boat, he saw another man watching from the hill road. Abram Grindle, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the same patch of river. In town, talk turned sour. Livestock started dropping in their pens with no clear sickness. The bell at Mount Olive tolled again at midday for no one. Isaiah watched the farmers come in for feed, watched their glances slide away from the hill, as if it were a sore tooth. He had seen this kind of silence before, in camps where men disappeared overnight, and their names vanished from the muster roll as if they had never stood in line. Silence, he knew, was not absence of knowledge. It was knowledge pressed flat, like a hand over a mouth. Clara tried to keep her little classroom running. She added new names to her slate, neat white letters for children who could still come. Each time she did, she felt the absence of the ones who had been erased by folded papers and sealed notices. She began to keep a second list in a small book she hid under the hearth brick. Luca Price, Henry Schull, a child from the hill whose name she had never been given, only a glimpse of a pale face at a window. On that list, Clara wrote what the papers did not. Last seen, near Hill Road. The first real chance came in late January when the east wind tore across Merrill County and rattled every window pane in Ash Fork. A federal inspector, sent to check on grain stores and draft numbers, rode into town with a thin horse and a thinner patience. His name was Walker, and he had no love for backwater counties that miscounted their dead and their harvests in equal measure. Walker demanded records, tax bills, burial permits, ledgers. Hart laid them out on the courthouse table, his fingers twitching as he placed the Grindle stack on top. Walker flipped through the papers with a disinterested air until he hit the double-stamped tax bill. His brows drew together. He turned it over, saw the half-erased note about underhouse inspection, and looked up sharply. "Why incomplete?" he asked. "Who stopped it?" No one answered. Hart felt sweat bead at the back of his neck. Sheriff Deacon shifted his weight, the floorboard under his boot, making a tired creak. Walker tapped the paper. "We will see this place," he said. "Today. Under the house as well." It was the sort of clear order Isaiah had heard many times in uniform, and for a moment he felt a flash of something like hope. A small crowd followed them up the hill that afternoon. The sky had a low, bruised look, as if the clouds themselves were holding their breath. The Grindle house loomed above, boards gray as old bone. The crawl space slitted off with new planks and a hatch door under the kitchen lean-to. That hatch was padlocked with a thick iron hasp, its key nowhere in sight. Walker demanded the key. Abram produced a ring from his pocket. keys jangling like small metal bones. He sorted through them with careful fingers, held one up, then another, and at last fit one into the lock. It turned with a stiff, reluctant motion. As he did, a smell rose from the gaps around the door. Earth, yes, and damp cedar, but under that something sweeter and wrong, like flowers left too long in a sealed room. Before Walker could lift the hatch, a shout came from the road. Eli had run all the way from the ferry, hat in hand, face flushed. "The river," he panted. "The water has dropped again." There is a box on the bank with county markings on it. If it had been anyone else, Walker might have ignored it. But county markings meant federal interest, and duty tugged him toward the river like a hook. They left the hatch half unlatched, boards still pressed down but only held by their own weight. As the group turned back toward town, Isaiah glanced over his shoulder and saw Abram kneel by the hatch with his hand flat on the boards, as if soothing a restless animal. By dusk, when the inspector's attention had been drawn into a maze of mismatched freight records and missing crates, the chance was gone. Later that night, Hart went back to his desk to check the ledger figures once more. The page that had held the double-stamped tax bill note was torn clean out. Only a jagged edge remained in the binding, fibers ragged, ink along the edge smeared as if a thumb had dragged along it in haste. Somewhere in the dark, cicadas that should have been silent in winter buzzed once and then fell quiet. Remember the ferryman's chit, with the same number written twice for the hill road crossings. When spring finally broke over Ash Fork, it did not feel like relief. It felt like a fever breaking too late. The drought eased, but the river did not rise as much as it should have. The cypress roots remained more exposed than before, black fingers still clawing at the air. The box Eli had seen on the bank was gone now, washed further down or dragged away. In its place, the mud bore a long, shallow groove where something heavy had been moved toward the hill road. Papers began to multiply in town. Notices of relocation. Receipts for labor that could not be traced back to a living man. Burial permits for strangers who had no kin in Marrow County soil. Hart found his desk drawer swelling, with documents whose edges all seemed to point in the same direction. Each time he tried to bring it up to Sheriff Deacon, the lawman held up a hand and said the same thing. War years make bad records, that is all. Geneva heard more than that. In her back corner of Mount Olive, needle flashing in and out of cloth, she listened as women whispered in the pews before service. A cousin gone, a niece vanished after taking work on the hill. A box carried through town at dawn with no name written on its lid. Geneva could not write her own name, but she could sew straight as a ruled line. So she began to speak in thread. In the hem of a Grindle girl's Sunday dress, she stitched a note in tiny backstitch, using a lighter color where the fabric itself was dark. 3 words, the same as before. Under the house. In another garment, bound for a widow who cleaned at the courthouse, she sewed a date and the letters HP for Hill property. She watched as those clothes moved through the town, as if the fabric itself had begun to gossip in a language only the careful could read. Clara, reading those hidden messages when a child fidgeted and turned up a cuff, started adding more names to her secret list. She began to sketch a crude map on the back page of her little book. Hill Road, ferry dock, courthouse, church, lines of travel for crates, for wagons, for families that did not return. Yet every time she thought of going to Walker, she remembered how quickly his attention had been diverted, how easy it was, even for a federal man, to set down one thread when a thicker rope of trouble was offered. Isaiah spent more time on the edges of town now, moving between the church, the ferry, and the small photography studio that had opened in a former feed shed. The photographer's assistant, a quiet woman named Elsie, had her own ledger under the counter. She recorded sittings, payments, and which backdrops had been used. One tintype in that book troubled her. It showed the Grindle clan standing stiff as fence posts in front of their house, a dark doorway yawning behind them. When she developed the plate, a faint shadow showed in that doorway, a shape that did not match any of the figures in front. She had written beside that entry, "Doorway figure unclear, paid in cash, no second plate taken." The end, when it came, did not look like justice at first. It looked like illness. One by one, members of the Grindle clan began to show up in town with gray faces and trembling hands. They came for lime and for herbs, for anything that might settle a stomach or clear a head. Abram came last of all, walking stiffer than usual, the skin at his temples shiny with sweat. The town muttered about bad water, about some pestilence creeping up from the black soil. But Isaiah had seen this pattern before, in camps where latrines had been dug too close to wells, where orders about sanitation were ignored because they were written by men, seen as outsiders. He watched as the Grindle children fetched bucket after bucket from their well, the bucket that threw back a faint rainbow sheen when the sun hit it. He watched Abram pour powder down the shaft, muttering about cleanser and sulfur, convinced he was making it safe. Hart, meanwhile, had found the missing page from his ledger in a place nobody thought to look. It was folded into the back of the house tax folder, stained with damp as if someone had held it in a sweating palm for too long. On it, in a rushed hand, was written, "Inspection. Under house denied by owner. Risk of collapse due to overburdened foundation. Recommendation: reduce load or reinforce." The note was unsigned, the bottom edge torn where a name might have been. Collapse due to overburdened foundation. The words stuck in Hart's mind like a burr. He thought of the crawl space, boards closing it in, the heavy drag mark on the riverbank. He thought of the faint smell that rose when the hatch had been unlatched. He thought of the new lumber hauled up the hill and the extra weight it might have pressed onto those old pilings. Numbers and notes, lines and loads all whispered the same thing. Something under that house had reached its limit. One night in early summer, a storm rolled in from the east, the first real one in months. Lightning walked along the ridge, slow and deliberate. Rain hit the Grindle roof in hard sheets, soaking the packed earth under the house for the first time in a long while. As the ground swelled, old joists shifted against new weight. The overburdened foundation, warned about and ignored, began to give way. Neighbors said they heard a sound like a long sigh, then a crack that split the night. The Grindle house lurched on its pilings, the closed-in, crawl space strained, boards bowing out like a swollen chest. Abram, who had gone down to check the well in the storm, felt the ground move under his feet. For a moment, the hill itself seemed to breathe in. Then something under the house let go. Part of the structure dropped with a groan, slamming down onto whatever lay below. The pantry lean-to warped as its floor shifted, the hatch under it buckling. Mud surged up in the crawl space, carrying with it a wave of trapped air that burst out through the seams in the boards. The smell that rolled downhill into Ash Fork was thick and sour and old, a smell of long-kept secrets finally forced into open air. At dawn, the whole town could see that the hill house had sumped. It no longer stood straight on its pilings, but leaned like a man with a broken leg. The pantry roof had cracked along one edge, and the hatch under it hung half open, one hinge torn free. From the road, it looked like the house had tried to swallow something too big and failed. Sheriff Deacon wanted to declare the place unsafe and leave it at that. But the storm had done what no paper had managed. It had pried open the underhouse. When reports reached the federal office, Walker returned, sour and tired, but bound by duty. This time he brought a writ in triplicate, stamped with seals from higher offices than Marrow County had ever seen. The crawl space would be examined. The house would be recorded. No exception. They met at Mount Olive rather than in the courthouse. The church smelled of lamp oil and damp hymnals, the air thick with breath and old incense. In front of the altar, A rough table had been set up. On it lay the objects the town had gathered, as if the things themselves were waiting to speak. The cellar ledger, torn corner gaping, the duplicate burial permit with mismatched initials, the double-stamped house tax bill, bruised like ink spread across its face. Eli laid his 2 fairy chits beside them, the repeated number, written in his rough hand. Elsie placed the tintype of the Grindle clan on the table, the shadowed doorway behind them dark as a wound. Geneva, hands shaking slightly, unpicked a hem in front of the group, exposing the tiny stitched words she had hidden months before. Under the house, HP, dates that matched the torn ledger page. Clara opened her secret book. She read out the names on her list, her voice steady. Luca Price, last seen near Hill Road, no permit. Henry Schull, letter of removal, does not match mother's speech or hand. Unnamed child from Hill window, seen once, never again. Each line was another weight on the table. Each name balanced the columns that had refused to settle. Walker listened. Isaiah watched him, gauging whether this man would fold or stand. Hart, pale but determined, read the note from the missing ledger page aloud. He pointed to the warning about overburdened foundations and to the date it was written. Weeks before the first disappearance. Someone had known the danger. Someone had chosen to keep stacking weight anyway. They went up the hill together after that makeshift hearing, a line of townsfolk and officials moving through heat that felt thick enough to cut. The house creaked as they approached, as if protesting the attention. The hatch under the pantry gaped wider now, mud crusted along its edges. Walker ordered it cleared. Men shoveled heavy wet earth away, their faces turned aside from the smell. They did not describe, then or later, exactly what they saw under there. They only said that the ground had been disturbed and filled again, many times, and that there were more remains than any official record had allowed for. What mattered, in the end, was not the details, but the pattern. Layers of wrong weight, pressing down until the house gave way under what it had been made to hide. A foundation built on secrecy and miscounted lives, finally forced to show its true sum. In the weeks that followed, Ash Fork moved like a person waking from a fever dream. The Grindle house was condemned and then dismantled. Boards hauled away before the hill could learn to close over that particular wound. The well was filled with lime and capped with stone. Children were told not to play there, not because of ghosts, but because the ground itself was not right for running feet. There were hearings in larger towns, papers filed and refilled as higher authorities tried to make sense of what Ash Fork had allowed. Abram, already sick from his own well and crushed by the partial collapse, answered questions from a pallet in a town infirmary until his fever took him. His words were written down, weighed, and set against the objects on the table from Mount Olive. The objects spoke louder. Isaiah left Merrow County not long after. He said he meant to follow the river north, to where the water ran clearer, and the silence did not sit so heavy on people's shoulders. Before he left, he sat with Clara on the steps of the empty Grindle Foundation. They watched the evening light slant across the stone outlines of what had been. Doors without walls. A pantry corner opening onto nothing at all. Clara had a new notebook now. In it she made a different kind of list. Names of children she meant to teach to read. Names of families she would visit in person when a child missed class more than 2 days in a row. She sketched not just distances but paths, writing down which houses had crawl spaces and which did not, which fields sat near the river and which near old wells. She taught her pupils to write their own names, full and clear, on slates and in margins and on the insides of their shirt collars if they wished. Geneva kept sewing. She still hid notes in seams, but now they were less often warnings and more often quiet encouragements. A date to remember, a name spelled correctly in the hem of a dress, sent to kin far away. Each stitch was a small refusal to let the ledger erase what it did not find convenient. The county made one more change. Hart was given permission to keep a second set of records, copies that matched the first line for line, stored in a locked box that rested not in the courthouse, but in the church vestry. Keys to that box were held by 3 people at once: Hart, Reverend Gable, and Clara, the teacher. Doors and paper and keys, all learning, slowly, to open in the right place and close in the right place, too. Remember the double-stamped tax bill for the Hill House, the warning about overburdened foundations nobody wanted to hear, until the house finally fell. Decades passed. The war ended. Reconstruction rose and fell like a wave that never quite reached Ash Fork in the way the law books said it should. Children became parents, then grandparents. The river kept moving, slower in dry years, faster in flood, but always with that quiet ticking against pilings, like a clock counting something deeper than hours. In 1912, a new teacher arrived in Merrill County. Her name was Eliza Finch, and on her first day the older folks noticed the way she walked up the hill road without glancing away from the empty lot where the Grindle house had stood. Eliza had grown up on stories told in low voices at kitchen tables. Stories about a ledger that tore itself, a hill house that leaned, a crawl space that finally gave into its own weight. Clara had been her grandmother. The little hidden book of names had come down to her in a box of papers, along with a photograph and a folded tax bill stamped twice. Eliza took a job at the small school and a side position helping in the county office. She had a mind that loved order but did not trust it blindly. When she opened the vestry box for the first time and saw the duplicate records Hart had kept, she felt a chill that was not from the stone floor under her feet. The cellar ledger, fragile now, still carried the torn corner. The duplicate burial permit with its wrong initials had browned almost too unreadable. The fairy chits were brittle, but legible. She also found the tintype that Elsie had saved. The Grindle clan stood in their stiff clothes, faces turned toward the camera, with expressions that tried to be neutral and landed somewhere closer to wary. Behind them, the shadowed doorway gaped. Eliza held the plate at an angle under the light. In the darkness of that opening, she could just make out the faint suggestion of a curve where no wall should be, like the edge of a buried mound. Eliza began to teach local history as well as letters. She did not dwell on gore or on whispered sins. Instead, she lined up dates and papers, showed her older students how a tax bill could lie and a ledger could strain against the lies it was asked to carry. She walked them to the hill lot and asked them to listen, not for ghosts but for the way their own footsteps sounded on that ground, heavy, then lighter as they walked back into town. In the evenings, she wrote. She copied the old documents in a clean hand, adding her own notes in the margins. Here, a warning ignored. Here, a name erased and recovered. She understood that paper could haunt louder than chains if someone bothered to keep it. That was the real inheritance Clara had meant to pass on. Not fear of the hill, but a map of how silence had been built there, board by board and stamp by stamp, so it could never be built in quite the same way again. If you are hearing this story now, you are part of that work. You are holding the weight of those objects in your own mind for a while. The ledger with its torn corner, the fairy chit with its repeating number, the seamstress note hidden in a hem, the tintype with a doorway that never meant to be seen so closely. These things speak across the years, reminding us that what we turn our eyes from does not vanish. It only waits under the house, under the hill, under the surface of the river that remembers. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to know in what city or small town, in what quiet room, this old story of Ash Fork and the Hill House is settling tonight. If you are new, subscribe. If you have been here a while, you already know we do not look away. Here on Tales Never Told, we follow the paper trail and the whispered names, not for shock, but to understand how communities build their silence and how sometimes, under pressure, that silence finally breaks. If this story has held you, if you could almost smell the hemp and ink in the courthouse, feel the crawlspace breath under the hill house, hear the river ticking against the ferry pilings like a clock that refused to forget, leave a like to let the algorithm know these histories matter. Share this with someone who thinks secrets can stay buried forever. In the comments, tell us what you believe haunts Ash Fork more deeply. The bodies under the house, or the years when everyone in town chose not to see them. Stay close, because the next time we meet, we will open another box in another forgotten county where doors and records and rivers are still trying to tell us what really happened.